I've been a lead developer at the Rabobank Internet online security for a couple of years, and I specialize mostly in Java, Spring, and security. And in my spare time, I do basketball. I'm a national basketball referee as well, and I have 1.9 kids, so I do have my phone with me. I hope I don't get cold. If I do, you'll just have to do it without me. So, what will I be discussing today? Clicker still not working? Clicker still not working. The outline will be as follows. First, I'll start talking a bit about what's out there, what's been going on the last couple of years. And then I'll start talking about a bit of theory. I'll tell you to look at how to look at your application from a security perspective, how I can do some modeling of your attackers, how I can do some risk assessment, and I'll end up with a couple of vulnerabilities and countermeasures, which I think you all should be aware of and try and implement. So here we go with the real presentation. What was going on in 2016? Well, it's already 2 years ago. That's a long time. One of the things I found very interesting was the adult friend finder breach. At that time, there was a lot of data leaks, a lot of accounts being released to the public at large. And adult friend finder was a bit of a wake-up call, because until then, it was like Yahoo had 1 billion accounts, but adult friend finder was of course, a network which not everybody wants to be known to have an account over there. The second thing which was interesting to me was that the most secure organization in the world got hacked. The NSA got hacked and their hacking toolbox got released. And the third one, which was also interesting to me, was that the banks or the banking system got hacked as well. And that's also a very system which should be really, really secure. And it was breached. Okay, so that was 2016. There were a lot of accounts being hacked. Also, the big firms got hacked. So the general consensus was that 2016 was a very bad year for security. Well, and then 2017 came around. And what happened in 2017? Well, the interesting thing, it was maybe a small blip on the radar, but it was well known to quite a few people. It was that WannaCry hit. And WannaCry, of course, was ransomware, and that's logical because the hackers wanted to get some money, and Bitcoin was, 2017 was definitely the year of the Bitcoin, and they started using ransomware. And for WannaCry, they started using that same NSA toolbox, which was released a year before. Well, okay, WannaCry happened and came and passed. And then the big one hit, which was, well, this is the logo for NotPetya or Petya, which was also ransomware. And this was, of course, the biggest threat and the biggest cybersecurity event in 2017. It's been called the most devastating attack ever. Okay, what's more going on in 2017? Well, something similar. HBO got hacked, and the Game of Thrones episodes got leaked. Also ransomware. So what you can say in 2017, so last year, was mostly about getting money, getting paid. And they did so using ransomware. So what's going on in this year then? Because this year is entirely different. Or maybe not. This year, all of a sudden, we see the surge of crypto mining. So what this means is that all your applications, all the servers, if they're hacked, they suddenly start crypto mining. So it's no longer anymore about ransomware, but it's about getting the money directly. And when you think about it, that's quite logical. The hacker could start using ransomware to get money, but that means having a middleman, namely somebody who has to pay him. And with using crypto mining, the service just start crypto mining for himself, so he gets some money directly. So 2018 came, and we're still in there. And what are we going to do about it? Still no clicker. That's a shame. Because we still have to make software. And the threat is very diverse. And then, of course, 2 weeks ago, there was this gotcha password database which got released. And we saw in 2016 that the NSA toolbox being released gave an uptick in all sorts of different threats. And what will happen tomorrow? Well, honestly, I don't know. And I can't help you with that. What I can do is tell you how to build a more secure web application. And to do that, we need to look at our application in a certain way. Yeah, and to do so properly, first I need to talk about a bit of terminology in that, which I'll be using in this talk. These are 5 things. When I'm talking about assets, I'll be talking about the things which we're trying to protect. When we're talking about vulnerabilities, still no clicker. I'm talking about anything they may be, which can be abused, so they may be bugs, or there may be architectural choices which we make, because we need to decide the application needs to be usable as well. That can definitely hamper security, but it also gives a vulnerability. And so these vulnerabilities may be intentional. The next thing which I'll discuss are threats. When I'm talking about threats, that's just anyone or anything which can abuse a vulnerability. That can be, of course, a single person being malicious, but it can also be a worm doing nasty things. My clicker starts working, great. Then I'll start talking about risks. And risk, when I'm talking about risk, that's just a function of assets, vulnerabilities, and threats combined. So when there's the value of the assets is higher, it means more risk. When there's more vulnerabilities, or the bigger vulnerability, it means more risk. And similar, when the threat is higher, when there are more people being able to abuse the vulnerability, then the risk is higher. So it's really simple and abstract. And the last thing which I'll be talking about are countermeasures, and that's just anything which reduces risk. So when it's possible as a countermeasure to lower the value of an asset, that's a proper countermeasure. And the thing to note is that countermeasures are also assets as well. So when you start building applications and you have countermeasures in place, they're also assets. They also have their separate risk, and they need to be protected. So we have these 5 terms. Let's do a really quick feel of sample countermeasures, which this means. I just said assets. Well, if I start protecting an asset with a countermeasure, you could say I put the application in the cloud. And when you start putting an application in the cloud, all of a sudden you don't need to worry about the network anymore. So the network is no longer an asset, so the risk is reduced. Of course, now we get a new asset, which is the cloud. Probably has a different risk profile. And when you start looking at your application, this may be a good solution for certain problems. Similarly, when you start looking at a countermeasure for your vulnerability, you can use something like input validation that prevents injection attacks. And when you start looking at threats, how can you use a threat? Well, use like authenticated endpoints. When you start using authenticated endpoints, not everybody can use your application anymore. So in this very simple way, it reduces the threat. Now, I knew all of this when I work at different clients, but I still had my code turned up with a vulnerability. And something which I'd like to show you. I have this application, and it was built in Spring MVC. So that's a model view controller technology, for those of you who don't know. And we used Spring because we thought, you know what? Spring is well tested, it's secure, it lowers complexity. So it's a good trade-off for us to use. And I'll show the application right now. Let's see if I can still get a browser over there, because that was one of the main concerns. No, I can't. Well, that's a pity. I'll do something like this. There we go. I just show myself a login screen. And when I log in, I just get a simple page being shown to me, which says, hello, John Doe. So it means we have some user information over there. And it shows which event he's going, which he's going to. So there are also some user data being part of our model. And this is easily hackable. Now, I was aware of this going on, this vulnerability, which I'm talking about, but I forgot something about it. Let's see if I need to blow it up a bit. Can I do something like this? There we go. I need to modify the URL a bit. Because all of a sudden we see a reflection attack. Now, of course, you're all going to say, well, Koos, you did something wrong. Yes, I did. But next, I'd like to show you the code. And I wonder if anybody here can tell me what's going on. There we go. What we see here is a piece of Spring code, and the actual code which is executed is just this simple get mapping. Yep, I get a, oh, well, great, I have a pointer which works. That's all it does. There are no assignments anywhere, but all of a sudden we do see that the model was changed. And why is this? And I made a note to myself, please close the magnifier. I'll close the magnifier. Why is this? Well, because this framework does more than I want. All of a sudden it starts using data binding, and as you can see, the user has a full name attribute. And since our HTTP request had a parameter matching the same, Spring does auto binding, and then all of a sudden our model is attacked. So we have this reflection attack. Now this is what they call a mass assignment vulnerability, and I was caught by it. It's been used in 2012, so it's a long time, on GitHub, but it's also available in Play and Rails and all sorts of different frameworks. And I was, of course, quite unhappy when this occurred. You can definitely fix this, and we did. But it also goes to show there's a very large set of different vulnerabilities available, and all sorts of attacks which are available on your code. So what I'd like to discuss next with you guys is, on girls, by the way, I'm so sorry, is discussing the different types of attacks which you can protect your application against. So when you're talking about attack types on your application, a very common framework, an acronym, is STRIDE, and I'll share it with you over here. STRIDE is an acronym. It stands for spoofing, tampering, repudiation, etc. The one reminder I also have to say, repudiation, what's repudiation? Well, that's being able to deny that an event has occurred. So, for example, when somebody owes me money, and he pays me back, and I have the ability to say, well, I don't remember that, then he still owes me money. So that's repudiation. And all these different attacks attack our system, but do so in different ways, and do so by attacking different properties of our system. Because there's a big difference between a denial of service attack and information disclosure. So when you start looking at properties of your application, sadly I can't, I just noticed that there was this pointer still being over there, and I can't remove it. Okay. When you start talking about properties of your application, the three things you need to think about are the CIA. Now, CIA, it's not, of course, the real Central Intelligence Agency. It's an acronym and stands for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And they line up in the following way. So you see this tampering attack actually attacks the integrity of your system. So it means that when somebody is tampering, your data can no longer be trusted. And when you start working about a denial of service attack, then yes, your data is still fine, nothing is leaked, but you can't use your system. And there also, you see the spoofing and repudiation attacks. They don't really align up. That's true because they mostly enable attacks. So when you start using a spoofing attack, it doesn't actually do any damage to your system. But what occurs then is probably something your system should protect against. Because when you start impersonating somebody, I can get his data and I can disclose that information. So that means when I have a spoofing attack, that's not so much a problem, but the most of the problem is then what happens next. And yeah, okay. You have these properties, these CIA properties. So when you start thinking about your application in these three properties, you also need to consider that your application probably values these properties differently. When you start looking at, for example, an accounting system should never be able to be tampered with. Should it always be available? Probably that's a bit of a lesser concern. Should it always be confidential? Well, yes, it should be confidential. But most importantly, it should not be tampered with. And similarly, when you start looking at, well, I discussed Adult Friend Finder, where privacy is a concern. So when you have something like a dating application, it should remain confidential. And when you start looking at availability, well, when you start thinking about autonomous driving systems, then all of a sudden the same attack on an autonomous driving system has much more impact, because availability is very important. An denial of service attack on an autonomous driving system is probably much worse than an autonomous driving system on an accounting system. Even though it's still the same attack. So what this means is that when you have these different types of attacks, they differ for different systems. They're more important for different systems. That's something really you should really be aware of, because when you're talking about a specific attack, it may definitely not be a valid attack for your application, or at least not an important attack for your application. So we have these attackers, and they use these attacks. But what can we say about these attackers? What is it that they're doing when they're doing a denial of service attack? Well, the one thing I always start a discussion with when you're talking about denial of service attacks and attackers is show them something like this. And of course, yes, this is a denial of service attack. It's quite hardcore. It's an F-117 dropping a laser-guided missile on a data center in Iraq. And if you just happen to have your application there, then you have denial of service attack. Now, yes, you're laughing, and rightly so, but this is an attack. But when I start discussing this, most people say, well, no, that's not really the threat which we're talking about. That's great. Because it means that they have this split between what they do consider a threat and what they don't consider a threat. So at least we can do some categorization of types of threats which we need to defend against. Because honestly, I can't defend against it. So how do you classify your attackers then? How do you start this discussion? A very simple way is just to say, you know what, we'll do it by size. We have a single individual, we have a group of individuals. So we have a single hacker, we have something like anonymous, or a hacking group, or a collective. You can go even bigger, you have organizations, so maybe Apple doing the hacks for you. They have a lot of money. Or, of course, the end is, of course, the government. And when you start discussing modeling your attacker, you can at least consider what sort of risk you're willing to take. What is allowable? Do you really need to defend against organizations attacking your application with the intent to destroy your organization? If that's a viable threat, if you're a product owner, if you're living in a system which wants this covered, then you know that you don't really need to worry about governmental attacks, but you do need to worry about single hackers and their other capabilities. And it's quite interesting when you start thinking about, well, how do you classify attackers? Well, what do you talk about the amount of money they're willing to spend on an attack? If you start thinking about a single individual, the question is really simple. I can pick anybody out of you here and ask you how much you're willing to spend to destroy an application. And that's roughly a good estimate. When you start thinking about a group or a collective, maybe 10 of you guys, so multiply that by 10. When you start talking about an organization, well, that's a bit more difficult, because how big is that organization? But at least you can start a discussion and try and put a bit of a limit on how much your attacker is allowed to do in terms of money. Now, another way you should model your attacker is thinking about when you're thinking about what he's allowed to do. I messed up my slide here. Is he allowed to use social engineering? Is social engineering really a threat? And social engineering, by the way, is using fast talking, so that maybe when you're doing an attack, talking your way into the server room, or maybe talking to somebody on the phone and getting them to allow them access. Or physical attacks. That F-117, for example, is definitely a physical attack. What about inside jobs? What if it's actually one of my colleagues being the attacker? do I need to defend against these scenarios? And when you start discussing all these, you all of a sudden notice that sometimes you can't defend anymore. You have to stop, and you have to accept that you've lost. And when you realize that, the next question comes, well, when have you lost? Because when I'm modeling an attacker, I want to know what I need to defend against it and what I don't need to defend against it. So you have questions like, is it when somebody can read all my data? Or when he has root access at my server? How bad is that? If my application is running and somebody has root on my server, do I still need to be able to have the integrity and the confidentiality and the availability of my applications be intact? Maybe somebody root with all my servers, or somebody who can listen to all my network traffic. When I told you in the start that maybe going to the cloud is a valid countermeasure, when I have something like a network listening, that's something that's then only covered by the cloud and not so much internally. Maybe a malicious sysadministrator. So when you're trying to model your attacker, you really need to consider what he's allowed to do and what you're willing to defend. And this is quite important. When you start your discussion with colleagues or with your product owner about what an attacker is, or all the other stakeholders, it's really hard for them to say, well, we accept loss over here, because they don't want to accept that they've lost. But when you turn around, when you start with something definitely way out there on the spectrum, like that F-117, they'll definitely say, well, that's not something which you should protect yourself against. So with these two combined, you at least can start a discussion about when a threat is too remote and what you need to defend or not. What you can then do is start a bit of risk assessment. Now, risk assessment, it sounds really nice. I have to put up this slide. The problem is there is no such thing as proper risk assessment. It's really, really hard. And why is that? Well, how do you put a value on your assets? When I go to a product owner and I ask him, well, how much do you value your application? He will say a lot. And when I ask him, well, can you put a dollar amount of that? He will maybe say 2 million. That's fine. And then I ask him, well, what about just the availability property? How bad is if your application is not available all the time, maybe 95% of the time? Those are really hard questions. And I might even say that these are the easy questions, because an even harder question then is, what about intangible assets? Because my application definitely also has intangible assets. I mean, things like, what about reputation damage? What about the strategic importance of the application which you're building? Maybe the stakeholder buy-in which you're using through this application. All these assets need to have a value if you want to have a decent countermeasure estimation. How much can you spend on countermeasures? So when you try and start doing this by putting values in there, it doesn't really work. So what can you do? Well, you can go qualitative. So you can say, you know what, we start modeling an attacker qualitatively. So we say, what types of attacks do we roughly cover? And what types of attackers do we find more important than others? And I've shown you a simple way to do that. You can start modeling your assets qualities. Well, I've gave you a hint of saying, well, probably one property is more important than the others. And that'll help you with doing a bit of risk assessment. When you have this application and you know that, well, availability is less important, that also means you can say, well, the risk is probably less important. And you can start having a bit of a discussion with a colleague or with your product owner about what is an acceptable risk. And you can't do this in absolute terms. You can't say that's like a risk of 50,000 euros, but you can say it's probably more important than a different risk. And in a sense, it's a bit like an estimation session for your risks. So you just have Scrum, You do an estimation session, only now you're talking about risk. And you start categorizing them, only now you do it relatively. You don't know the actual size of the risk, but you can say, well, which risks are probably bigger and which risks are probably smaller. However, the one thing you do need is to know what the size of your vulnerabilities are, because I said, well, a risk, that's a threat, that's an asset, and that's a vulnerability. So how can you reasonably assess the size of a vulnerability? It's quite simple. Google it. The sad thing is you can't make a really good idea of how big a vulnerability is, most of the time because you don't know what the vulnerability is. What you can do is make educated guesses. You can say, you know what, the chance that my database all of a sudden is leaked, well, it may be there. I'm not sure how big that problem is, but I can add some defenses against it. And you can start and do some research about it. And then all what's left is just a lot of talk. You talk with your product owner. You get a bit of a consensus. And above all, be aware that yes, this is a bad plan which you're making, because it will not be 100% covering everything. But it's still better than nothing. It still gets you in the process of discussing security.
I have a question there.
Yes?
Actually, when you talk about this, I think, well, you have a lot of talking with product owner, but he's not the only one who's at the position to decide, because you at the company level is concerned.
Yes.
Further to have a discussion about the chief security officer or something like that.
Yes. So to repeat your question is, it's probably not only your product owner, which is a stakeholder here. These risks go probably much higher. You may have a chief security officer being part of the board. Now, if there really is a chief security officer, then yes, I do expect there to be some sort of paper trail which saying what sort of policies you need to follow. And there will be some local local security officer, and he is also a stakeholder. Now, when you start talking purely about Scrum, then yes, you could say that's a problem of the product owner, because he should be the single person responsible for that. But he also said that yes, there are multiple stakeholders, and you all need to reach a consensus. So definitely it means talking to a security officer. Say hello to the security officer, say, you know what, can you help me, because we're trying to model this application, and get the product owner involved. Because the product owner will probably say, well, it's really nice if you want this to all these very expensive countermeasures, but it's not worth it for our application. And maybe a security officer will say, yes, they are, because there are strategic assets. And maybe your product owner will say, okay, then we have to make them. But you have to help them. If you don't start the discussion, if you don't say, you know what, we have these vulnerabilities, I did some research. Can you please tell me if these risks are worth it? Because if you do find them worth it to use a countermeasure against, then you at least should get the product owner to sign off on it, or a security officer. Does that answer your question?
Well,
Yeah, I can't go into very specific details in here, because the problem, of course, is that varies from company to company, if you're a really small company or if you're a really big company. Also, depending on the project, on the product which you're building. That's why I said, well, they're different for an automotive project, or a accounting system, or a dating application. They all have different properties, so different types of attacks also measure differently. So to resume, I was talking about doing researched, educated guesses. And I thought, you know what? Let's do that with you guys here together. And girls, once more. Let's look at a protection for your password strength. Now, how do you know that your passwords are safe? Well, we said they've been hashed, and they're in our database, and now let's assume that our database is leaked, and we want to make sure that these passwords don't end up in the gotcha database. So how hard is it to retrieve these passwords? Well, let's try. hopefully this works. Apparently it doesn't. That's a pity. Then I'll have to go to a browser and Google it. I hope I'm typing correctly. Any typos? No typos. Well, great. So my first hit is actually an online tool which apparently allows me to crack SH8256 passwords. Well, let's see what happens. Okay, looks legit. Right? Let's see if I have some hashes over here. I do have some hashes. Let's just paste some hashes in there and say I'm not a robot, and let's start cracking. Now these are, of course, very secure passwords, as they would be filled in by your users. And yep, they're all found. So within just a couple of clicks, I was able to start cracking simple hashes. Well, that's something to remember. When you start talking to your product owner, you say, okay, apparently this may be a very big vulnerability. So how does this work? Well, Crackstation just has a really, really, really big database of prepared hashes. And they also say it only works on unsalted hashes. So we should start looking into salted hashes then, if we weren't already. And if you aren't already, you definitely should, because you've now seen how easy it is to crack passwords when they're not salted. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. And it also says what the salting is. I should close a window over here because... wait a second. There we go. On my side, I couldn't see my notes because they were covered with the hashes already. So, apparently we can use salted passwords. Now, the interesting question still remains, can you brute force these passwords? Well, when you start brute forcing passwords, you need to remember how complex are passwords actually by the user. And that's where the gotcha database is really interesting. And there have been databases like this before as well. This is a bit older. What you see over here is a table of the difficulty of passwords for roughly 500,000 passwords. And what's interesting to note, there we go, we see that at least less than 1% has more than 50 to 55 types of entropy. And when we're talking about types of entropy, they're actually talking about bits of entropy. So how much is that? Can we actually build a system which can try and guess these passwords? So 2 to the power of 50 is a lot. Okay, so let's see. Well, we have this Bitcoin mining farm, and you can Google it if you want to. And they have 25,000 machines in China. Well, that's a lot, but still not 2 to the power of 50. And then you start looking, well, how fast is a Bitcoin mining machine? And I start looking, and I said the top mining machine does 14 terahashes per second. Well, that's also a lot, but how much is that? So you combine the two, and then I see they have 2 to the power of 58. So what this means is that in a single second, such a setup could guess your passwords with 99% probability. Okay, well, that's definitely a massive vulnerability. And we're still researching, so okay, we may need to do something else. But first need to consider one thing: how big is this threat actually? Can this be done? Well, what I didn't talk about, how much does one of these machines cost? They cost $4,000. I have 25,000 of them. So how much does it cost? Well, that's a cool 100 million. So if you just happen to have a spare 100 million lying around, then yes, you can do this within 1 second. You probably don't. Of course, machines are speeding up all the time. Last 5 years, there was a 25-fold speed increase. So this price will definitely be dropping. But it gets even worse. I'm saying it can be done for $4 per second. Because why can't we do this in the cloud? Can you imagine just having a cloud system somewhere which costs 100 million to operate, to build? But when I just ask for $4 per guess per 1 second, doing that 24/7, 365 days a year, I get even more than 1 million. So if anybody willing to make a good investment, try and build one of these systems, and the hackers will pay you. Of course, it hasn't occurred yet, so the question then becomes, how big is this threat? Because that's what we're trying to get a feeling of. We said 100 million, well, that's definitely, well, maybe big companies may be able to afford that. Governments may definitely be able to afford that. But I'm guessing a group of people over here won't be able to do so. So we're still researching, and we think, well, maybe this is a vulnerability which we need to approach in a different way. So why not start hashing differently themselves? Now, hashing is meant to be very efficient and fast. And what if it's not? Because if it's not, then these machines, they need to take much more time. So we can look at those. There are two interesting algorithms for that. One is bcrypt, and bcrypt essentially says, you know what, I'll hash it multiple times. And you can say how many times that will be. So what then happens is that it's no longer fast, because instead of 1 hash, it has 1,000 hashes. Then again, when I'm talking about, well, it uses only 1,000 hashes, well, that means I need to rent for 1,000 seconds instead of 1 second. So if that's secure, I don't know, it may be. Of course, you can go even further than that. You can say, yeah, you know what, let's just hash it 1,000,000 times. bcrypt supports that. That works. That's probably secure. The other way to look at it is using scrypt. Now, scrypt works by making the hashing use a lot of memory, and because of that, it's really inefficient. As some of you may know, for a processor to retrieve something from memory is similar to similar to us doing a request for something which is stated on the moon. So it takes a long time. So when you start needing to use memory for encryption, the entire algorithm becomes really, really slow. So that's definitely a really good countermeasure against these hashing machines or these really big rigs which might be able to pop up in the future. Another way to look at it is, well, hashes are apparently, these hashes are sensitive data, so why don't we encrypt them? We could. That's just like credit card information apparently. So why don't we just use encryption? Now, I'm not saying which are a valid choice here, but we've made a bit of an assessment right now because we've looked at all sorts of possibilities. Now, what does this mean? Well, I talked about scrypt, and there's just one tiny thing about it. It's very effective against attacks on the confidentiality of our passwords, but it also takes a lot of processing and memory power. So that means that the availability of a system is all of a sudden a problem. When you start using scrypt or bcrypt, it's quite easy to imagine a simple denial of service attack, but just using invalid passwords. Because when I start using an invalid password, all of a sudden my machine is doing 1,000 hashes. And I do that 200 times a second. Is this effective? I don't know. Ask your product owner. Is it acceptable that your availability might suffer for a very confidential database? And I thought, well, what about encryption? Well, you can use encryption, and it definitely works for our scenario. Our scenario, of course, was, well, our database is leaked. And how does that occur? Well, usually it's because an attacker has access to the system. And the encryption key is also on a system somewhere. So honestly, how big is the chance that the attacker has only access to a single system and not access to multiple systems? Again, that's something to ask your product owner. Maybe they'll say that, yes, that's definitely true. We have this very secure system which makes sure that all the keys and the encryption is done on a separate server, and you don't know that. But probably it won't be effective. And as we see it, well, just plain salting, well, we said it's definitely not effective. at least for type 4 attackers. But how credible is that? And in the future, it may definitely drop, maybe even as low as a simple person like you and me willing to pay $4 to crack a single account. So what we've done now is use this vulnerability of passwords, and we've got a bit of a feeling about how big these vulnerabilities are and what their risks are and what their trade-offs are. Because I've been discussing the threat level, and well, of course, the asset was fixed. So up next, because we're going quite quickly, is vulnerabilities and countermeasures. I said there were 3 things which I'd like to give to you all. And the first one, which I think is the most important, is also the oldest, and probably the most easily overlooked. And that's complexity. When you have a really complex application, your security suffers. When you have multiple branches in your code, you really can't get a good feel of what your application does at all times. So when you really want a secure application, you need to make it really, really simple. And that sounds simple, yes, I know. And I know that it's really, really hard. I've tried. It means talking to your product owner and saying, you know what, Mr. Product Owner, we don't want all these strange edge cases. We want just a single case for everything. And maybe you can convince them to do that. Maybe you can't. But every time you can't convince them, you have to accept that your security suffers. Not the first time, not the second time, but definitely the 4th, the 5th, and the 10th time. So, yeah, strive for code without any branches. Make sure that every layer has a single responsibility, because that makes it easy to reason about. In short, the solid principles, and a bit more. Be really, really professional about this. I didn't know it. Hans gave a really nice talk about, of course, in the keynote. And he said, it takes a lot of rigor, and this is definitely rigorous programming. And it also means discussion with all your colleagues. What is solid programming for your what are these solid principles, and how do we apply them to our application? How can we make sure that we maybe look at our business logic in a certain way, which makes it sure that we can remove all sorts of edge cases, because we can use generic solutions. The second vulnerability which I'd like to talk to you about are libraries. And I've shown you Spring as a nice framework, which may contain features, which may be bugs, or at least give you problems, but can be even much worse than that. Do you trust these libraries? And even worse, do you trust all the dependencies of these libraries? Now, in Java or in .NET, most of it is open source, so yes, you can see the source code, you can recompile it yourself. I could ask if anybody here does that. I don't think anybody does. I don't do either. I trust Maven to do its work. But it's even worse when you start looking at the front end. Because the front end, of course, has this Node package manager most of the time. And there was a really interesting article which came up in January. And it went something like this. You know what? I've written myself a really nice Node module. And what it does is it does some coloring of log files. Really innocent. So really innocent. And he said, you know what? I made this really nice, simple package, and I'll start adding it to all sorts of open source projects. And most of the time it got rejected. Some of the times it didn't. Okay, so now all of a sudden he has a package in his custody, which is used by all sorts of bigger libraries. And the thing is, you're talking JavaScript, so it's being minified. It may be being a bit obfuscated as well. And what he started doing is, you know what, I can simply make sure that although the actual code which I present is valid, my minified and obfuscated code is poisonous. And he poisoned it. At least that was his theory. And lo and behold, that was January. Guess what happened in February? Exactly this. There was a content delivery network which all of a sudden started delivering poisonous JavaScript. And there were over 4,000 sites using this content delivery network. And the person who did that was really happy because he started mining for cryptocurrency. So how can you protect against this? Oh, and by the way, yes, we're back to crypto mining. I said, of course, this is the #1 attack. Well, it shows. So how can we protect against something like this? Well, I've discussed the model, so let's look at how it matches up in that model. What is actually the asset here? The asset here is not so much our application. The asset is the user's browser. What's the vulnerability here? Well, the vulnerability, of course, is our software delivering this malicious data. And what's the threat? Well, of course, yeah, some attacker able to modify our application or modify our content delivery networks. So how can we counter this? Well, I just said a countermeasure is either a reduction in assets, so can we lower the value of the browser somehow? Or can we prevent the vulnerability? Can we make sure that our application no longer serves mining software? Can we prevent attackers from abusing this vulnerability? Well, some of that, of course, is something we can do because that's simply our application. What we can also do is start tying down the browser. Now, the browser is always considered to be a security risk. Usually, when I was at clients, we said, you know what? The browsers are out of our hands, so we have to assume that it's malicious. But of late, there have been some tools, and I'll show you these tools. I'm not sure if you're already familiar with them. If you are, great, you should use them. The tools which I'm talking about are content security policy, and that's a header which can be sent to the browser, and currently all major browsers support it. And what it does is it allows certain actions in JavaScript. So, for example, you can't use dynamic JavaScript evaluation, you can't use inline scripting, you can't use resource loading from unspecified hosts, all sorts of different things, and it means that when a browser can no longer use this, the asset, of course, becomes a lot less worthy for an attacker. So how does it look like? Well, a simple example. Let's see if I can show it a bit over here. What you see over here is a content security header as it's being sent. And it actually defines a policy. It says, you know what, there's a default source which says nothing, so I disallow everything. And it also shows the types of errors which can be shown to a user in his console. So what this does is actually it makes the browser a bit of our friend. At least we can a bit control about what he is and is not allowed to do. The other thing, which is a way to make the browser our friend, is to use SubResource Integrity. Oh, I still left my pointer. And that's an HTML attribute which prevents library changes. So we talked about this. I've shown the attack on these 4,000 sites by using poisonous libraries. There is an HTML attribute which prevents this, and they didn't use it. It looks like this. It just has an integrity attribute. And what then happens is that the browser starts retrieving, in this case, the CSS. And when it's done, it starts using a hashing algorithm, which is defined, in this case, again, SHA-256. And if the hash matches, all is fine. But if all of a sudden the JavaScript library is modified, then you get an error, and it stops loading it. So these two methods can definitely prevent these types of attacks. So how many people are using this? Oh, questions? Question over there. No question? No question over there? I saw questions. Well, I thought, how effective is this? Well, once more, let's start Googling it. Because Google is your friend. At least, so they say. What we have over here is what I'd like to show you is the Mozilla Observatory. And there we go. And it allows us to do a simple scan of a site, and it'll give it a bit of a rating, and it tells us how secure that site may be. And when we start looking for content security policies, we can see, well, how many people are using this content security policy. So let's just start at Google themselves. There we go. It's a D. And what you can see here is that they don't have a content security policy. That's interesting. SubResource Integrity, they don't have that either. Well, that's a shame. Well, maybe Google did something wrong, or they don't consider it to be a bit of a problem. Or maybe I just got unlucky. Maybe Amazon, big web shop. They're not doing much better either. Well, that's strange, because I just told you that everybody definitely should use this. Let's get back to my presentation. So apparently it's really hard to do this properly. And why is that? Well, of course, when you start thinking about it, all of a sudden I tell the user, the browser, that it can't do a lot of things. When I have all these libraries, they use these things, so I can't use a lot of libraries anymore. So apparently you have to make a risk trade-off, and apparently Google did this as well. And they said, you know what, we have our own libraries, we think we're secure, and it's too much work to modify everything. Is it worth it for you? Well, SubResource Integrity is something which you can easily integrate into your build process. So definitely do that. When I start using CSP, or the Content Security Policy, it's tying your hands, and that makes it really hard. If you're starting a new project, that's fine. You can still pick and choose your libraries. And if one of these libraries has problems, you can either choose and allow these libraries, because your the content security policy does allow for some weakening, although any weakening in security is just being bad for security. When you're using a new project, when you're using an existing project, you can try and build it up from there. You can definitely use a content security policy which allows almost everything, and try and restrict from there. So those are 3 things which I would suggest that you all do. I have no clue what my timing right now is. I think I'm running fairly quick. Almost 12. Oh, that's great. Well, I said we'd start a couple of minutes late. I have a short summary over here as well. So when you start discussing security, you really should consider what you will and will not defend, what you can and cannot defend against, because it will help you frame your security issue. You can discuss this with stakeholders. And when you start coding, try and keep things as simple as possible. So keep starting a discussion with your colleagues. How can we make this simpler? Not so much less code, but simpler, because you need to be able to reason about it. If I see all sorts of branching statements, that fills my head. So try and keep things simple, and tie down the browser as much as you can. That's all I had for this talk. So any questions? Yes, in the back.
So I was wondering, so the integrity is supposed to protect against malicious libraries, right? The integrity attribute.
Yes, correct.
If the developer of the library has written malicious code himself, hash will match that with malicious code. So how does that protect?
Okay, to repeat your question, the question is, well, you have this SubResource Integrity, and it has this integrity attribute, and that definitely protects against modifications by third parties. But what if that's not actually the case? What if it's already bad to begin with? That's your question, right? You're out of luck. However, having said that, what you can definitely still do is use content security policy, because it means that all sorts of attacks which the malicious library writer used can no longer use. So it's a second way to protect yourself against it. As said, it may be a very hard thing to do, and it may definitely be an incomplete security measure. You could always, of course, you say, you know what, I don't trust this library, so why don't you just download it yourself? Get the code and start serving it locally. There's also maybe an effective countermeasure. Does that answer your question?
Yes, kind of, but from the NPM dependencies is like Lighthouse libraries being rejected.
That's correct. Yes, the problem is indeed that when you start using npm, you have like 5,000 libraries and you can't check them all. That's definitely true. So that's why I said the problem which was described in January came down quite hard in the security world, because they said, oh dear, yes, that's definitely a problem because everybody sees that problem, and so do you. So that's why I say, please start using a content security policy which ties it down as much as possible, and start praying. Any other questions? No? Okay, well, I'd like to thank you for your time. Don't forget to fill in feedback forms. If you have any feedback, please tell me. I'm very interested as well. I'll be walking around here the rest of the day as well, so if you have any questions, you know where to find me. There's also the app which can show you where I am. And that's just it. Have a nice day.